So for the last few weeks and months, given our curfew schedules, we often had to do Maariv early and sometimes under interesting circumstances. And many have asked exactly how this happens, why it happens, when it happens, what are the parameters, and where does it come from? So there's copies if you want to follow along here. There's also copies upstairs in the corner there if you'd like to follow along. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the original source, which is a Mishnah, a dispute in the Mishnah. We're going to see how the Gemara frames the dispute. And then from there, we're going to skip many generations from after the Gemara and come directly to the conclusion. There are many discussions that happen in the generations post this Talmudic discussion, which we're going to read in a moment, before the Code of Jewish Laws ratified conclusion in like the 1500s. But we're not going to go through that whole discussion. We're just going to come to the conclusion. And from there, we're going to go to the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, and select a number of passages from there in which we're going to see that conclusion play out in real life in a number of circumstances. Now, there are two critical chapters in the Code of Jewish Law that discuss this issue that are missing from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe wrote a Code of Jewish Law, actually twice he wrote it. The second version is completely destroyed, except for, I think, 4, maybe 5 chapters that we still have that are still extant. And even the first version, we have most of it, but not all of it. And it so happens to be chapters 31, 230, 233, 34, 235. These are the ones that discuss this issue in greater depth, and it's missing from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, from the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law. So we're piecing it together from other places in the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, based on what we have from the actual original Code of Jewish Law from Rabbi Yosef Cairo, in lieu of what we don't have from the Alter Rebbe. So let's begin, and we'll move through it. So we're looking at the first Mishnah in chapter 4 of Tractate Brachas. You can see there 26a. I'm going to read it in the English. So for our point, we're going to look at the afternoon. The afternoon prayers, right? The first Mishnah defines what time for the morning prayer, morning, afternoon, and evening. We pray 3 times a day. And each of these prayers have a specific time when they are to be done. And here the Mishnah lists the dispute for each of these 3 times. So we're looking at the afternoon prayer. According to the Rabbi, the sages, the Chachamim, the afternoon prayer may be recited until the evening. That is from midday till the evening. Rabbi Huda says it may be recited until a midpoint of the afternoon. That's what the word Plag HaMincha means, halfway through the afternoon, which is, as they write it here, the midpoint of the period that begins the sacrifice of the daily afternoon offering and ends at nightfall, which is the end of the afternoon. Okay, so before we get to understanding exactly what this means, let's start with the following. When we say morning and afternoon, we don't mean before and after 12 o'clock. That's to start with. Let's just put that out there. I'm sure many of you are aware, there's something called Shah's Manias, which basically means hours based on relative hours. I guess that's the way of translating it. Relative hours. Halachic hours, but literally Shah's Manias sound something like relative hours. In other words, our hours, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and so on, are essentially arbitrary. They just took a 24-hour cycle it takes for the sun to do a rotation, and then they divided it into 24, and there's your hours. It's really, in some sense, arbitrary. Halachic hours actually follows day and night. So whatever time of sunrise is, and whatever time nightfall is, that itself is disputed. If it goes till nightfall, if it goes till sunset. Let's just go with nightfall. Starting from dawn till nightfall, take the largest size, and you divide that period into 12 sets. Each one is another hour. So midday is not noon, but midday is the point at which the sun is directly above us. Right? So to make it easier, we'll just say that the sun, it goes from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. It just makes it easier to frame ourselves. But if it goes from 7 a.m. to 5 a.m. as it does 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. as it might in the winter, or even closer together at 4:30 p.m., right, then your halachic hours are not 60 minutes. They're much shorter because you're taking that period and dividing it into 12. And then in the summer, in that same winter, your night, which goes from 5 p.m. till the next day, 7, is giving you much longer than 60 minutes. That's what halachic hour is, just to make that clear. And therefore, when he says here until evening, doesn't mean 6 p.m., it means till nightfall, which in our scenarios, let's say 6 to 6. And if we're halfway through the afternoon, is we have to look at when, as it says here, the midpoint of the period that begins with the sacrifice of the daily afternoon offering and ends at nightfall. So nightfall on one extreme, the daily afternoon offering at the other, smack in the middle, that's halfway through mincha, that's plaga mincha. And that would be the end point for the afternoon service in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, and the beginning of the Maariv service, the evening service. So let's look at the Gemara as it plays it out. On page 2, I put the Gemara and Rashi in Hebrew in the original. If you want to look that up, you can see it. But look at page 3 in the English. First, the Gemara goes through explaining why they even came to these hours, and essentially based on the order of sacrifices in the temple. Every day in the temple, there were 2 sacrifices, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And corresponding to that, we have the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer. And as well as there were certain parts of the offering that would stay on the altar all night and burn. And corresponding to that, we have the Maariv, the evening service. And the different opinions as to when the morning service can be prayed, when shachas can be davened, is essentially parallel to their opinions as to when they're allowed to bring the offerings in the temple. And that's the dispute. At which point did the afternoon offering end? Did it go all the way till the evening? Or did it go to this point called plaga mincha? So just look at the end. Or actually the second paragraph. And why did the rabbi say that the afternoon prayer may be recited until the evening? Because the daily afternoon offering is sacrificed until the evening. Now, Yehuda says that the afternoon prayer may be recited only until the midpoint of the afternoon, because according to his opinion, the daily afternoon offering is sacrificed until the midpoint of the afternoon. It's that simple. And then the last paragraph on that page 3. On that note, the dilemma was raised before them. Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that the afternoon prayer may be recited only until the midpoint of the afternoon, because that's when the afternoon offering ended. Does he say that midpoint of the first mincha, or does he say the midpoint of the last mincha? And the Gemara concludes it means the last mincha. To explain what that is, very briefly, the large mincha starts a little bit after midday, because a little bit after midday is when theoretically, earliest point, you can bring the afternoon offering. This is explained in Rashi in the previous page. So it's called the big mincha because you have much more time in your afternoon to come, because it's earliest point in the afternoon. So it's a large afternoon. That's literally what big mincha means, a large afternoon. You're starting earlier, so you have a larger afternoon. Or do you start much later, which is 9.5 halachic hours from when sunrise was, putting you halfway between your afternoon, right? Each morning till midday is 6 hours, 6 halachic hours. After midday till evening is 6 halachic hours. So large mincha starts 6.5 hours in, half an hour after midday, giving you 5.5 hours to go till the end. So it's the large mincha. And the smaller mincha starts 9.5 hours in from the morning, giving you half of your afternoon, only 2.5 hours to go. Sorry, 2.5 hours to go. Now, if half of mincha means half of the smaller mincha, so you got to split half of your afternoon, a quarter of the afternoon, giving you only an hour and a quarter before the day is over, an hour and a quarter halachic hours. So these are the times we're talking about. The bottom line to say of all this is, the sages say the split between afternoon service and evening service is at nightfall, and Rabbi Yehuda says that split between afternoon service and evening service splits an hour and a quarter before nightfall, an hour and a quarter of halachic hours before nightfall. That's the bottom line dispute. Now here's the key to remember that often gets people confused. Remember that the dispute is not a question of when is night and when is day. That's not what they're arguing about. They all agree when nightfall is. The argument is when the offerings were offered, and therefore when you can do your service. So even if Rabbi Yehuda's view is you are still today in Wednesday, because nightfall hasn't hit yet, you can still daven Maariv. You can still daven the evening service. Because in the temple, again, what was the evening service symbolize? Right, the afternoon mincha corresponds to the afternoon offering. So you can only daven mincha so long as the afternoon offering was being offered in the Beis Mikdash, and that would be until plaga mincha, right? And Rabbi Yehud, the sage's view is that you can go as long as till the evening, because that's when the afternoon offering was offered. What's Maariv coming to? What is the evening service? Maariv, what does that correspond to? It corresponds to certain parts of the animals that were left in the altar to burn overnight. Well, when did it start burning overnight? It started burning as soon as you were done the afternoon offering. So if you end the afternoon offering still during the day, then you can do Maariv during the day. So the dispute is not the question of when does day end. Make that very clear. It's not a question of when day ends. It's a question of when afternoon service ends and when Maariv begins, when evening service begins. Why is this important? It's important because there's a huge discussion as to whether or not this dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages with regard to prayer, davening, does the same dispute apply to Shema? The Shema, the Torah says, is when you lie down and when you get up. So if, as I just explained, the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages are not a question of when day ends or when night begins. It's just a question of when the time for the next service begins. If that's the case, then even if you're davening Maariv early, you still have to say Shema later. Right? And the same thing would be with Sfir Sa'omer, and the same thing would be with other things as well. So it's important to keep that in mind because there are disputes within disputes within disputes. You have the original dispute here between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages when the switch between afternoon service and evening service begins. And then you have disputes as to how far does this dispute go? Does this dispute go so far as to say that as soon as you can daven Maariv, it's already nightfall, and then you can't put on tefillin anymore, and then you can say Shema right away. You have to say Shema later, right? So there's a dispute within disputes. We have to keep that in mind as we go through the various different scenarios we're going to look at. So the first text we're looking at here, I don't have the English translation, I apologize, but it's on page 4, and what we're looking at is the Code of Jewish Law written by Rabbi of Cairo. You can see the turn of the century between the 1400s and the 1500s, and this is Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. Orach Chaim is the first book of the 4 books of the Code of Jewish Law, chapter 1-33, which is one of the missing chapters in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which is why I'm quoting the original Shulchan Aruch. And there he mentions this dispute. And then the gloss that Amma explains, as we explained earlier, that this discussion is not a question of the hours on the clock, but the hours of the relative hours, depending on when sunrise and nightfall is. And then look at the second picture there. It says like this. Now we conclude. The Ovid Kamar Ovid, one who wants to follow this opinion, good for you. With the Ovid Kamar, and one who wants to follow that opinion, also Ovid, also good. So usually when you have a dispute in the Talmud, at some point post the Talmudic era, the sages will come to an agreement. This is the conclusion. But when it comes to this dispute, the dispute remains open-ended. And the Chachamim and the sages have concluded that you can choose whichever one you want. So you can decide, I'm going to follow Rabbi Yehuda, and every day I'm going to daven mincha before plaga mincha, because plaga mincha is the ending of mincha time, and every day Maariv after plaga mincha. Or I can decide to go with the sages, and every day mincha up until nightfall, and Maariv every day after nightfall. Right? And that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Vahu, and you can do this, sheyasa la'olam kechad minayu. It's only if you always consistently follow one opinion. Because if you're going to go with the sage's view and do mincha all the way till the nightfall, you cannot daven Maariv at that same time because you're contradicting yourself. You've davened Maariv now because you're taking Rabbi Yehuda's view that Maariv starts at plaga mincha. And now what, you can daven mincha because the sages say you can daven mincha now. The Maariv you just davened indicates that you should have davened mincha earlier. And that's the key here. You can choose whichever view you want, but they cannot be contradictory. In fact, as the Shulchan Aruch says there, you should have a consistent view your whole life. Pick one. Either Rabbi Yehuda, and henceforward, you always make sure you daven mincha before plaga mincha. Always, you treat plaga mincha as if it's nightfall, and Maariv whenever you want after. Or you're always like Rabbanon, and you never daven Maariv before nightfall. Always, never before nightfall, even if it's after plag, because you got to pick one of the two opinions. But as you can see, he concludes at the end of the wide set of lines, However, in b'diavad, if post factum, his followed first average the plaga mincha, he said that in his country, the custom was to follow the view of the sages, to treat nightfall as the breaking point between mincha and Maariv. And therefore he says, nonetheless, if it so happened that you daven Maariv before, Yotza, you fulfilled your obligation for Maariv. And here's the key. And when it comes to extraneous circumstances, you can daven Maariv early. And the Ramah, who's the Ashkenazic law, says that in Ashkenaz land, the custom was the opposite, where they used to go with Rabbi's view and always split between Plaga Mincha and, as before and after Plaga Mincha, as a difference between Mincha and Maariv. Good question. We're going to leave that open-ended. That's a very good question. What exactly mean b'shas adchak, and to what degree we can take that? But on the surface, it just means, right, so it's a good question. Yeah, but we're going to, on the surface, what he means is that you can break from your usual custom, and because you have to, for whatever reason, even though you always go to Rabbi Huda, today you're going to go with the Chachamim, because you need to have Maariv, because you need to have Mincha late or something. Or you always go with the Chachamim, but today you're going to go with Rabbi Huda because you need to have Maariv early today. Because of, thank you, there we go, this is what we're getting to. This is the key words here, b'shas adchak. Then we're under extraneous circumstances, then you can pick one or the other view, even if it's against your consistent usual practice, which is interesting that a person should have, ideally, a consistent practice. And then he has exceptions to the rules, whichever one it happens to be. Here in Montreal, I would imagine the accepted practice is, like the sages, we break at nightfall, and we do early under extenuating circumstances, some of which we'll see in a moment from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. So let's continue on to page, look at page 5, you can see the title page there. Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, Orach Chaim, chapter 90, laws relating to a fit place for prayer and to praying while traveling. So these are extenuating circumstances. The person is traveling. So go to the English on page, page 6. And he's talking about how if you look at the last paragraph, I put like 3 arrows pointing at the paragraph, indicating that's the highlight, that's what we're highlighting. Keep the booklets and read through the whole thing, you'll get a better view. But just for the purposes of our discussion, zooming onto this last paragraph on page 6, where there's the 3 arrows pointing at it. So he's talking about the importance of davening with a minyan and davening in a shul, even if you're not with a minyan. And if you can't have neither a shul nor a minyan, when you daven at home, daven at the same time that they're davening in the shul. Daven at the same time, even if you're not in the shul. And then he says, similarly, people who live in outlying settlements where there are no minyanim, right? There's no 10 people to daven with him, should recite the morning and afternoon prayers at the time that the other Jewish congregation prays. So the nearest town, they daven every morning at 7, so you should daven at home at 7. They must, however, wait until the appearance of the stars, that is complete nightfall, to recite the evening service. So go with the sages. Don't do like Rabbi Huda and daven early, even if the local shul is davening early. Why? Because the leniency of allowing that service to be recited before nightfall was granted only in consideration of communal difficulty, that it would be impossible to assemble the congregation again for the evening service at night if they were to go their own ways after the afternoon service, as will be explained in section 235. This is the missing section. Section 235 is one of the missing sections from the Alter Rebbe. So, but we can insinuate from here what he says, that there's a special, under extenuating circumstances, if the community is such that everybody's coming from Mincha, they're going to leave, and we're not going to be able to get them back from Maariv, so daven Maariv right away. It sounds like, even if it's not split between plag and not plag, so it sounds like, it could be. We don't know because we're missing that section, but it could be. But either way, certainly, you can call for Mincha early, pre-post plag, if you can't get them people back for Maariv later. And that would explain why we daven Maariv early during curfew. You can't get everybody back for a minyan. So you got to daven Maariv early. And therefore, those who pray alone, by contrast, must recite that service at its appropriate time. So this guy who's out of town, he can't say, look, the minyan nearby is under extraneous circumstances, they have curfew, so I'm going to daven early also. You're stuck at home anyway. So you have no excuse to daven early. And therefore, he says for you, daven on time, as you usually would, following the opinion of the sages. So here we see already leniency number 1, extenuating circumstances where the only option to get a minyan from Maariv is to daven Maariv early, permission granted. Leniency number 1. Let's go to the next page and see another leniency. So look at the next page, page 7, you see the title, Untitled Code of Jewish Law, Chapter 267, laws pertaining to prayer on Friday night. Now this is not just a leniency, it's actually an instruction. So go to the next page, page 8 of the English translation. It is customary to recite the evening service earlier than on weekdays. This is a fitting practice so that one accepts Shabbos as early as possible, provided that it is after Plaga Mincha as explained in section 261.5 and 263.6. In the back of the booklet, I put those two sections there so you can see it there. There he's talking about lighting Shabbos candles and how early we are obligated to bring Shabbos in early. So how early can you go? You can go as early as Plaga Mincha. And therefore, when you're davening Maariv on Friday night, and in that davening Maariv, you are declaring Shabbos. So here's the uniqueness. I mentioned before that Rabbi Yehuda might be of the view, at least according to some opinions, that the issue of Plag being a split between morning, afternoon, and evening is limited to prayer, davening, but it could be you're davening Maariv while it's legit still Wednesday, right? Which means on a regular day, this is true. I can daven Maariv after Plag HaMenach, and it's still Wednesday, because I'm following the Buddha's opinion that now is time for the Maariv carbon in the Beis Mikdash for the burning of the offerings. But on Shabbos, you can't do that. Because on Shabbos, once you daven Maariv, you've accepted Shabbos. Because in the davening, you describe Shabbos. And if you're describing Shabbos in your davening, in that action, you're taking in Shabbos. So your next day definitely starts at that point. So you can't have it both ways there, for sure not. As he goes on to say, that even those who usually recite the evening service in the appropriate time, i.e. after the appearance of the 3 stars during the weekdays, may recite it earlier on Friday, praying from Plag HaMincha onwards, following the Rabbi Yehuda's approach that Plag HaMincha onward is considered night with regard to evening prayer. Even though he occasionally does it the other way, and therefore it might be a contradictory leniencies, nonetheless, he shouldn't be worried about that because Shabbos is a mitzvah to bring Shabbos in early, as you can see. But conclusion of the second paragraph, and nonetheless, one must be careful not to recite the afternoon service that Friday after Plag, so that it will not be following two leniencies that are contradictory during the same frame, during the same time. So even though yesterday I considered the cutoff point at night, and today I'm considering the cutoff point Plag HaMincha, that's okay. But on the same day to say contradiction, don't do that. Okay, and then he goes on to say that a person should say Shema later. We'll get to the issue of Shema maybe a little later on. Okay, so there is exception number 2. Exception number 1 is extraneous circumstances where you can't get a minyan back. Exception number 2 is, not exception, actually instruction number 2 is taking in Shabbos early. I should note that it's not so simple, it's not so cut and dry, this idea of taking Shabbos in early. The custom here is that we often do. There is a response from the Alter Rebbe, there's a response from the Tzemach Tzedek. It's not exactly as cut and dry, but nonetheless, as you can see from the code from the Shulchan Aruch, it's quite clear that Friday afternoon, it's an encouraged practice to take Shabbos in early by davening Maariv early. But as he goes on to say that you could in theory daven Maariv later and take Shabbos in early via other means, just by declaring Shabbos or just by lighting Shabbos candles early, which is what those 18 minutes are. But just for the discussion of the Maariv, I'm mentioning this idea. You could, in theory, you could do that also. You can be Mekabel Shabbos with Kiddush. You can take Shabbos in early by making Kiddush early, and then daven Maariv later. You'd have to appoint someone to remind you daven Maariv because during a meal you're expected to lose track of time. But in theory, you could do that also. There's a few ways you can take Shabbos in: lighting candles, making Kiddush, davening Maariv, or actually just verbally declaring, "I now accept Shabbos," and finish. It's Shabbos for you. So you don't have to daven Maariv early to take Shabbos in early. But as you can see, or at least in the Shulchan Aruch, he says this is the preferred practice, even though elsewhere it's insinuated that maybe the preferred practice is to daven on time while taking in Shabbos early some other means. Okay, now here's another interesting halacha that while I was looking through some of the indexes on the subject, I found this. I don't remember reading it before. It's quite an interesting halacha. So I mentioned before that the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is technically only about Maariv, but it could be it's also about when night and day switches. Now, if that's the case, it has application to tefillin. As you can see here in chapter on page, page 9, chapter 30 about the Shulchan Aruch, where he writes, if one forgets to put on tefillin throughout the entire day, recited the evening service while it was still daytime, because the local community was davening Maariv early, So he davened with them. And now, after Maariv, he remembers that he didn't put on tefillin. Now, there are those who forbid wearing tefillin at night. Right? Now, it could be that if he davened Maariv, following Rabbi Huda's view, while it's still day, at least according to some opinions, he's actually turned it into night. And if he's turned it into night, he can't put on his tefillin now, because he's already davened Maariv. But nonetheless, he says to rely on the leniency here. Okay. Another interesting halacha on page 10. This is with regard to the halachas of forgetting someone who didn't say Ya'aleh v'yover in Rosh Chodesh, the special part of davening for Rosh Chodesh. So the halacha is if you miss davening, then you have to daven. No, sorry, this is not about someone who missed Ya'aleh v'yover. This is someone who halachas of someone who accidentally forgot to daven. So the halacha is if you forget to daven morning davening, you daven twice mincha. The first time for mincha, the second time to make up for Shabbos. Now, what happens if a person walks into shul? This is what he says here. If a person came to synagogue close to the time for the evening service and went to lead the congregation in prayer, reciting the evening service while it's still day, following Rabbi Huda, even though he had not yet recited the afternoon service, so he forgot to daven mincha. And now he just davened Maariv. So can he daven now twice? Did he already take on the daytime? Says the Alter Rebbe, don't consider it as if he intentionally, it was a mistake, and therefore he can still daven mincha after his Maariv, because on either one of two things, either it's actually mincha, or it's just a double Maariv and making up for his mincha. Either way, it's okay. Says actually the next paragraph says that right there. If that evening is Rosh Chodesh, he should include Ya'aleh v'yover in the second Shemona Esrei as well, for he has already accepted Rosh Chodesh. So he accepted Rosh Chodesh, but it's not night yet, technically. By Rabbi Huda's view, it's not necessarily night yet, so he can still do mincha. So he can daven mincha. Yes, so the second one will also have Ya'aleh v'yover. That's correct. Okay, moving along. Here's a very interesting one. Okay, we're running out of time, but I want to just. Okay, this is in the laws of an oinen. An oinen is someone who is mourning the loss of a family member, and during a certain period of time, from the moment of death until the body is interned, they're exempt from mitzvahs. Now, in paragraph 2 says the Alter Rebbe, all the above, that is to say that you're exempt from mitzvahs, applies only during the week on Shabbos, since it is impossible to see to the burial of the deceased, and the laws concerning the initial state of acute grief are not practiced at all. In other words, the Shiva hasn't begun yet, because Shiva only begins after burial. During Shabbos, there's nothing you can do. So if that's the case, one is obligated to recite the Shema and Shemona Esrei and to observe all the mitzvahs according to the Torah throughout the day of Shabbos, because there's no mourning on Shabbos and there's no preparation for the burial. Right? The reason why this person is exempt from mitzvahs is because he's preoccupied with taking care of the burial. Nothing to take care of. It's Shabbos. So toward evening, if the mourning proceeds to the end of the Shabbos limits, so that at nightfall he will be able to tend to the needs of the burial, he's exempt. So if he has to write this limitation to how far outside the city you're allowed to walk on Shabbos, but because this person has to take care of a burial, he walks to the edge, and as soon as Shabbos is over, he walks right out so he can take care of it. So that's the case. Right now, he's still busy with the mitzvah of burying, even though it's Shabbos, because he's walking to that edge. But if he's not, says the Alter Rebbe, he should also read the evening Shema while it's still day. Even though the congregation did not recite the Shema on Saturday night, it's Shabbos. And on Shabbos, even the communities which daven Maariv early, they won't do that on Shabbos. On Shabbos, they'll daven later, because you're supposed to daven later, so you can make Shabbos elongated. But in this case, so certainly the community is davening Maariv later, but nonetheless, by the time he gets to Maariv, he won't be obligated in Shema. And we want him to chap mitzvahs, we want him to get as many mitzvahs as he can before he reverts back to the point where he's exempt. So you tell him, daven Maariv on Shabbos. And that way, the day is not over, because Rabbi Huda doesn't say the day's over. Rabbi Huda just says that Maariv time began, but not the day's over. So it's not a contradiction to your Shabbos that you're davening Maariv early, at least according to most understandings of Rabbi Huda. So daven Maariv early, make Havdalah on Shabbos, without candles obviously, because you cannot violate Shabbos. But at least this way, you'll have gotten all the mitzvahs legit while it's still Shabbos before the person has become an oinen and exempt from these mitzvahs. Furthermore, look at the next page, chapter 293. And we relied on this halacha here in MTC for a few weeks, where there it says, page 12, a person is prevented from reciting Havdalah over a cup of wine at night due to circumstances beyond his control, e.g. must go tend to the matter involving a mitzvah, and goes from his home to the end of Shabbos limits while it's still day, as mentioned before, waits until nightfall, and immediately upon nightfall proceeds on his journey, may recite the evening service and recite Havdalah over a cup of wine in his home while it's still day, provided he does so from Plag and onward, following with his view. Right? This is not an oinen. He should not recite a blessing over the candle, as mentioned before. Now go to the next page. Since his intent is for the sake of a mitzvah, there's no concern if he desires to recite the Shemona Esrei while it's still day, without reciting the Shema, if he wanted to, or he could do otherwise, say the whole Shema and then say Shema later. So that whole Maariv early, which is what we did here. We did that here because a dear member of ours needs to say Kaddish, and that counts as a mitzvah. That counts as extenuating circumstances, considering that it was curfew. So we daven Maariv early to make sure that he can say Kaddish, even though, as you're learning, one shouldn't do so on Shabbos. But now we understand why we're allowed to do this, because Maariv is not a contradiction. Maariv doesn't automatically mean the day's over. There are opinions that say that Rabbi Huda means the day's over, but not necessarily. You could learn Rabbi Huda, they're just talking about davening Maariv, but the day still goes on. So daven Maariv on Shabbos, and the day still goes on. But nonetheless, look at halacha 3. There are authorities who maintain, number 3 on page 13, that even though the sages granted a person license to follow the leniencies mentioned in the previous subsection, it is preferable for a person to be careful not to do so because it will be confusing to people at large, which is why we're doing this now, to clarify for everybody. In other words, a person who has to do this shouldn't do this publicly because nobody knows what he's doing, and why is he doing this? Okay. All right, I encourage you to keep on reading. You'll see there are other details in halachas regarding this with respect to Sfiras HaOmer, but for another occasion.